I'll give you a story about this of two golfers. And one golfer for 15 years has played the same golf course every weekend, plays the same golf course every weekend. Another golfer for 15 years plays a different golf course every weekend, right? And then now we're going to put them in a competition. They're going to play each other, but they're going to play a new course. Which golfer do you think it's going to win? Golfer A, who's played the same course for 15 years, or golfer B, who's played a different course every weekend for 15 years? And the reality is probably all going to pick that the golfer B, who has played different courses, is probably going to win that game because they've seen different things. They've seen different experiences. They've seen different courses. Same thing with your career.
This is L&D Unlocked, a series for L&D and HR professionals looking to unlock the future of learning and development. Presented by BizLibrary, L&D Unlocked is an ongoing series where we speak to industry experts and thought leaders about the future of work, workplace trends, and how your organization can prepare today for the challenges of tomorrow. Learn more at bizlibrary.com.
Welcome back to L&D Unlocked. I'm your host, Chris Elliot, Chief Revenue Officer at BizLibrary, and joined today not by a relative, but all the same great, JP Elliot. No relation that I know of. JP, welcome to the show.
Hey, Chris. Yeah, we have to go check ancestry.com to make sure we're not related, but thanks for having me on.
Of course. Yeah, I think the first time we met, I mentioned I don't know how many times it gets misspelled, only with one T. I just assume that's how it will be spelled most of the time now.
Exactly. My wife actually wants us to change our name to one T, but we're gonna stick with two T's. Let's hold strong.
I don't know if I shared this with you. The first wedding gift we ever opened after our wedding, it was like a wall clock, and it had Elliot misspelled on it, and my wife was shocked. And I was like, oh no, that's to be expected. Just to get used to this. It'll happen for the rest of your life now. But,
right.
All right. I know that's not what we're here to talk about today. JP, for those, if they're not already following you, can you just a little bit of background, kind of your career experience today and what you're up to, both at work and with your podcast?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I am, I'd say, a talent and HR executive with 20 years experience, really leading talent functions at Dick's Sporting Good, McAfee, the Brinks Company. I've also dipped my toe in the water of being the chief people officer and VP of HR. So I think it gives me a good view of kind of not only what you need to deliver in terms of learning and talent perspective, but what it's like to be an HR business partner, working with business, closely. So that's really about my career. About my passions, talent, leadership development, org effectiveness. And about a year, and gosh, I don't know, a few months ago, I'm not sure exactly how many months now, 5 months ago, I launched the Future of HR podcast to really inspire the next generation of HR leaders. And that's turned out to be just a bigger success than I could have ever imagined, with over 100,000 downloads in 2023. So that's what I'm kind of up to. And that's kind of my mission, really, hopefully to inspire the next generation of HR leaders and make organizations better, make sure they've got the talent and capabilities to win.
Love it. Hey, so JP, one of the things that drew me to reaching out about having you on L&D Unlocked was content specifically about leadership development that's featured in many of the episodes of your show. I was wondering if you could start broadly with your perspective on how leaders develop and some of the things that you espouse as part of kind of your view of leadership development.
Yeah, I mean, like, definitely there's a science to how leaders develop, but I also think each practitioner, each of us as a professional should have a talent philosophy. And so I'd love to share my talent philosophy that kind of goes a little bit deeper because it's really important. So number one, talent is not generic, right? So I think a lot of times we're like, well, that person's a great talent. Well, they are, but talent's really defined by the strategy. It's defined by the capabilities required for a company. And it's gonna be very different if you are in a retail company versus you're in a B2B, right? The talent you need and required is gonna be different. So talent's not generic. And so you got to think about that differently and put that business cap on first. The second thing is that, what I would say the big three determine success for me. And you look at people's career, intelligence, personality, and how they fit predict success in a role. And so as a, think about leadership development, you got to look at those things, right? Do we have the person in the right role, the right company, the right industry? Will they be successful? I also believe you got to put top talent in critical roles. That's so important. That drives success. So you got to put your best players in your best spots, but you have to know that role can drive value and maybe drive a disproportionate value than other roles. And this kind of more than leadership development side, you need to invest in your best and place bets, right? So for high performers, high potentials, We need to help them grow through experiences and putting them in big jobs and letting them grow. That's really, really critical. And the last piece, which I'll get into more, is experiences really matter. We talk a lot about this, but leaders grow through, first and foremost, through experiences, on the job experiences, stretch assignments. That's how we grow. When we talk about the 70-20-10, right? 70% experience, 20% is coaching, relationships, 10% is learning. That's very well known in our industry. But most learning and development, most leadership development professionals, a lot of times we focus on that 10%. Oh, what's the learning that goes along with this? What's the, how's this tied to skills, right? What's in the coursework? That's great. Learning's helpful, but what's more important is the experiences. And so when you think about leadership development, we've got to get better at, really looking at the experiences and the assignments that people have and placing people in the right roles. Or frankly, if you're taking your own career in your own hands, you've got to think about, how do I get into that role so I can continue to grow and develop? That is really the most important thing. And so that's how I think about it. And I give you two stories, right? I'll give you a story about this, of two golfers. And one golfer for 15 years has played the same golf course every weekend, plays the same golf course every weekend. Another golfer for 15 years plays a different golf course every weekend, right? And then now we're going to put them in a competition. They're going to play each other, but they're going to play a new course. Which golfer do you think it's going to win? Golfer A, who's played the same course for 15 years, or golfer B, who's played a different course every weekend for 15 years? And the reality is, probably we all are going to pick that the golfer B, who has played different courses, is probably going to win that game, because they've seen different things. They've seen different experiences. They've seen different courses. Same thing with your career. That's not to go say change jobs every year, but the reality is, getting those experiences broadens you and deepens you. And you want to make sure that if you're in that same job, you're not getting the same experience for 15 years in a row. So that's really how core of what leadership is all about. Now, the 20%, 10%, we got to build that in. But the core is the experiences, and thinking of how do you get people to have those experiences so that they can really develop.
JP, there's so much to unpack there. Let me go back to one of the notes I'm looking at here. When you mentioned the kind of placing bets, when your best people and the best opportunities to shine, where they can have disproportionate impact. What are your thoughts? Is that specific to assignments, or does that placing bets and maybe being selective in how you use your resources, did that extend to training and development as well? Or do you have to be intentional about kind of who receives which of your resources if you've got limited bandwidth?
Yeah, you do. And my motto is really development for all, but targeted development for some. And so, you should definitely have development for every person. Everyone can get better, and should have availability of courses to take and experiences they can have. But there are a few that you want to develop in even more, right? There may be targeted programs for a sales leadership program. There may be other kind of learning programs you want somebody to go into, an early high potential program. That's more on the L&D side, the learning development side. From an experience platform, you place your bets and say, well, hey, we have an open role. Chris is a high performer. Let's put Chris in this new job. Even though you've never done it before, we think you can do it. We'll support you. We'll help you get there. So you're kind of placing bets on people in that way. And that might be more of a talent management kind of mindset, if you will, but they play into each other. So, but development for all, and I think targeted development for some, is the way to think about it. And I think most organizations honestly approach it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is sound advice, and agree. I think most take that approach. Where I see clients sometimes they get over their skis is, I have to have a one size fits everybody sort of engagement model, where I'm going to do elective for everybody, I'm going to do upskilling for everybody, and leadership for everybody, and it becomes overwhelming and quickly goes into one size fits nobody.
Right. Yeah, and I think the other challenge for training, learning development teams or L&D teams, we don't have unlimited resources and budget either, and time and people. And so you've got to be really focused on where you're going to have the biggest impact and the biggest bang for your buck. And so that's partnering with the business and your CHRO and different business leaders around that. But to your point, we can't always serve everybody. There's more demand for the services than we have time to deliver.
So JB, it's early February, so we're still generally at that time of year where everybody's going to it's finalizing their assessment of last year and plans for this year, or potentially the initial phase of execution. As you think about leadership development, and we're doing our spring cleaning, add, drop, swap, what needs to go? What are you seeing that maybe it's served its time and it's in the drop category, and what do we need to be doubling down on as it relates to leadership development this year?
Yeah, I think, it's hard. I guess what I was thinking about was really organizations where we sort of still doing wrong a little bit at times. So we kind of
Yeah.
fall in some traps. And I think one of the traps we fall into is just really falling for pseudoscience and fads. And there's things that, examples grit, right? The book Grit came out, terrific book. It's not really a psychological concept. It's hard to train for grit. Not sure, and look, if you're doing that in your organization, we all have CEOs that have read a book and think that everyone in the organization should now understand this concept and that's part of the culture. That's okay, but as an L&D professional, you have to know that's probably not going to drive business results, and you're doing that for a different reason. So watch out for fads, watch out for things that are, honestly pseudoscience at this point. I think also looking for the magic bullet, hoping to be one learning program, one technology, one thing that will
Hmm.
solve all the problems. It's just not going to. It's going to take a lot of things, to move the needle. It's a system we operate in when you're doing learning and development. I would say not having accountability from leadership or middle management around training and development in terms of making sure it's happening, that we're really sponsoring it, that we really bought into it. So getting that accountability is really critical. If we don't have accountability from leadership to support people to going to training, taking that time, or going to a program, or following up on those programs, then things will fail. So that's one thing we've got to always watch out for and be better at. And the last, you kind of already alluded to it. I would say instead of being so near term focused, short term focused, we need to be more future focused, right? Thinking about what are the future skills, capabilities we have the organization? How can we be building those? And hyper focused on making sure we're bringing that to life, right? It's not about what the organization looked like yesterday. It's what the organization will look like tomorrow that we've got to think about.
JB, what I love about that advice, I feel like you're drinking your own champagne on the advice you gave wasn't a fad. Some of those things are so tried and true of clear charters for why are we doing this at the beginning, and then inspecting kind of inbound requests against that. Does this align with why we do these things in the first place? Measurement of what we expect. I think is a premise of whether it's L&D or another functional area of the business, just foundational to success in executive support. I mean, I think what you're putting forth are some really sound principles that I think we try to chase the quick fixes or the silver bullets, but it's some of these principles just don't go away no matter what year it is.
Exactly, Chris. I think and it's easy to do. I get it. There's a lot of different consultants, vendors, reports, research that comes out every day. We're almost awash in that in HR, and it's everywhere. And so we're always feeling like
Yeah.
we're like behind. But the reality is, people don't change that much. We are simple humans. We have not, we are adaptable, but our human psychology hasn't shifted. And so
Yeah.
how we learn, how change takes place, how you can drive change, the fundamentals are there. And so I just encourage people to go back to the basics. And do you have the basics correct, right? Do you have all the alignment from leadership? Is this a mission critical training initiative, right?
Mhm.
Do we have the resources to make sure we knock it out of the park? And I think if you're doing those things, you're going to be successful. I think you start to get spread too thin, chasing different short-term fads or requests from a leader that may or may not make sense, and then we get into trouble.
So that's a good segue, JB. Something that's been featured quite a bit in your show. I want to kind of get your point of view out here. Relates directly to business outcomes. Be it value creation, enterprise value creation through L&D efforts. And L&Ds, they manage a lot of stakeholders. They got learners, frontline managers, business line managers, an executive team, all who have their own short list of wants and needs. And somehow in all of that, they have to deliver on programs and be held accountable to showing business impact. What are your thoughts in this area? How can they both achieve both, delivering on the request, but also making sure that it aligns to things that are going to move the needle?
Yeah, it can be challenging, but I would say my belief is that an L&D leader, we should never do a training program unless it's aligned to two things. One, increasing revenue. Two, increasing productivity.
Hmm.
And then the caveats below that is we should be driving a high performance culture. So this should align to the culture where we're going to, and we're developing leaders, right? So those are the four things, but start with, are we increasing revenue or driving productivity? And don't wait for the business to tell you what you think this initiative is trying to do. You need to come with a point of view saying, well, I think this training we're asking to do, this, L&D initiative, training is even too simple of a word. It's initiative. It's a change initiative. we hope it's going to drive this kind of revenue, right? And then you can say, okay, great. Well, that makes sense. I believe in that. Like, does your business leaders even believe in that with you, right? Do they say this is something that will drive revenue? If they come back and say, oh, no way, Chris, that's not going to drive revenue. I don't think that this program's not what we need. We need something else. I would say, great. If this isn't the way we think it's going to drive revenue, right, or increase productivity, do we need to have it? Is it mission critical? Is there something else we should be focused on? Or are we okay? We believe this is something else and there's a different reason for doing it that we're all aligned on. Where we get, I think, get in trouble is we want to have ROI and we hope we're going to have ROI, but we don't align up front. We don't have this conversation up front about what success looks like, right? What are we trying to do? And so when you measure that ROI, it can be challenging for all of us. I mean, the reality is not every training program is easy, or learning L&D initiative is easy to do that, right? And there's reasons for that, because it might be a time frame to measure the impact. It could be a sales program, but we won't see it tomorrow. It may be 24 months. Well, do we have 24 months to do that? Do we have patience to wait that long? So I think aligning initially and saying, hey, this is my point of view, or HR team point of view, on how we're going to drive the business with this initiative. Here's how we think that does, we can play that out. Here's how we're going to measure it. So you kind of think about Kirkpatrick's 4 levels. Of course, we're going to get reaction, learning, behavior is a little bit easier, but the results, it may be more challenging. You may need to get full finance in. It may be something where you've got to get the operations team to help you measure it, but you got to do all that up front. You can't do that once the program's going and then say, oh, now I'm going to try to measure ROI. You've got to start from the beginning with the end in mind. That's your best chance of having this be successful. But my belief is this: even if you can't get ROI or get results or direct link to results, by having that conversation at the beginning on what success looks like and why we're doing it and how it does tie back to the business, you're going to be seen as strategic, business focused, and they're going to be happy. The business will be happy with whatever you produce because you had that conversation up front, versus not knowing the expectation, deliver a training program, and then they say, Chris, this was what I wanted. This didn't deliver anything. I thought we were going to be able to get ROI. You're like, well, I could have, but I didn't measure things early enough. I didn't pull finance in. So it's really start early, get alignment, and then start with the end in mind.
Hey, JP, could you kind of share your experience? I think most of the time when we try to execute on that, good things happen. Like we have better, more positive results. I do think there's also that segment where you may follow that advice, but you get that business line leader. Like, it doesn't matter what you do to aid, they don't want training in their department. They just inherently view it as, I don't have time for, there's nothing you could do that would drive business value.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, how do you work with that segment of the business when it's a pure stonewalling of, I don't want to do anything in L&D. That's time that my people could be on, insert whatever it is that they do for the business.
It's a great question. It's a challenge. There's 2 things I would do. One, and I should have mentioned this, I think the best L&D initiatives are co-created with your HR business partners. So, bringing them in early is really important. We should not be siloed. We need to be like, hey, what do you think? How is this going to be successful? The business leaders better. You probably know the team better. Help us understand the context and make sure it makes sense. So don't put yourself on the hero path, because they may be an ally in that situation where they can go back to that business leader, the HR business partner, and say, hey, I think we need to do it for these reasons. And they might have more influence than you have because you don't work as often with that leader. So that's one thing. 2, look, we're not going to convince a business leader. If they don't want, and they have the pull in that organization and they can say, no, we're not going to do this training, what are you going to do? You can't do the training. You're not going to put a gun to his head that we're doing a training. You got to say, look, great. Okay, well, if you don't think that'll have the impact, why not? What do you think would have an impact? What would you like to see? How can we help you? Because maybe it's not a training. Maybe it's not learning, L&D initiative. Maybe there's something else you haven't thought of that is actually more around performance measures and accountability. Maybe it's incentives. Maybe there's another partner you can bring in that helps get to what you need. But I would look at that as more like a salesperson. It's not an objection, and it's not a sale till someone says no. So then tell me why you're saying no. Help me understand how we could solve it. Like, what do you really want to see? So I think it's more consulting at that point. And you still may hit the same roadblock, but at least you pushed, you've asked, and you have to decide. Now, if it's something that's enterprise wide and they're saying no, they don't have time, then it's a political issue more than anything else, right around that. And we know that the time is one of the main excuses we hear, right? And we don't want everything more micro and smaller bites, but sometimes that's not what it needs. So it's having that conversation too around, hey, I'd love to give someone 15 minutes on this, but really, it probably needs a day and a half. Like, and here's why. Again, it's an education process, but you may or may not be able to convince them.
Yeah, JP, I'll throw out one
What's your point?
perspective
Yeah, what's your point of
on
view on
this
this?
one.
Yeah, I'm curious.
I agree with everything you shared. Here's just one more thing that I think is the real cause of that kind of just stonewalling. Most business leaders, particularly if they're at a level that they could stonewall a training, they didn't get there by happenstance. They have career experience, and they've probably seen a lot of projects fail, over the course of a career. And one of the things I think is a key contributor to lack of executive support, it's actually not often the words that they say, that this won't have the impact, or I don't believe in this, whatever it may be. I think oftentimes the real root cause is they just don't believe that the organization can execute on it. That if the execution against the plan if there was a higher level of competence, I think a lot of times they inherently believe in the values of education and training. They probably have a 4-year college degree or more themselves, right? Most of the time, I think they value kind of continuous education. Is the organization really positioned to do this effectively in a way that will have an impact? And that's something else I would throw out there, is for that more skeptical audience, you may need to be a little more on your game than you otherwise would be on not just the concept of what you want to do, but the way in which you will give this person a guarantee of, like, not only do we want to do it, we have a clear line of sight as to how we can do this, and something that you'd be proud of at a quality level that you'd want to be associated with.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think if they're concerned about the credibility of the function, yeah, I need to unpack that too and understand what happened and where they thought things fell down and what they think should happen going forward. Again, I think
Yeah.
that's right. Um, there's so many different reasons why people will kind of push back on it. Sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's other reasons. Who knows? Maybe they're a business leader who's behind their numbers and they're afraid if they do this training, they're actually going to lose their job. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of the motivations can be deeper than just the training piece or what the initiative you're trying to push through. So it's great, but I think you're right, just to continue to kind of ask and understand like what's really going on and like how can we make this be successful is critical.
So, hey, JB, I love that you mentioned that first, like the credibility of kind of the L&D organization. Maybe you don't win that hard over. We'll just keep playing this narrative. Maybe you don't win them over today, but when it comes to building credibility of the merits of L&D, I think one of the best way that's done is by showcasing wins and value created to internal stakeholders. How do you advise L&D leaders to showcase the value they are creating internally, whether it be out or up? What are some of the things that you'd recommend in that area?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, credibility comes from knowing the business, right? And trust is when someone knows then believes you understand them and can solve their needs and problems and have the credibility to do that. So the credibility comes from like, hey, I understand the business. We've worked together. I know what will really help and work here. I've done the homework. So that could mean
Yeah.
showing up before you meet with this business leader and maybe you met with like 4 or 5 people on their team and interviewed them. Maybe you went out in the field and actually saw some things live and in action and kind of came back with insights around how things could get better. You got to come with some data that shows your stuff, right? And I think that's going to really help. The trust piece then says, look, I'm credible enough to say this is the 2 or 3 solutions that we can work with, or here's what I'm recommending and having confidence around that. Here's why I think it's going to work. And then the last piece, you have to kind of basically toot your own horn. Like you have to be able to say, if you've had some successes, you need to say, look, I did great. Look what we did. And hopefully beyond smile sheets, right? Behind reactions, like, well, and I get it. It's easiest for us to pull, but is there something else we can look to and saying how we did something in a time frame? And sometimes for leaders, they might just say, look, you were able to design a train, deliver a train for our sales team on this new product within 45 days. And that was a really fast time period. We had never seen it happen that fast. Maybe it's time that's more important to business because that matters, right? Versus that people take it and give you a 5.0. They're not going to care about that. They're going to care they got it to market and then hopefully behavior starts to change. So you got to be thoughtful about that. I wouldn't know what's going to make more credibility for every case.
Yeah.
Obviously, you can say, look, people who've gone through this program have higher sales or do more or better leaders. Great. But typically we don't have that kind of time frame. So it's really making sure that you're just aligned back to those big initiatives that the company's working on. And you could say, this is here's the strategy A, and here's what we're doing for B, and here's how that drives A, right? And people go, I
Yeah,
get it intuitively, even if I can't always put numbers on it. I think this is the right thing to do. And that's where a lot of times we end up in L&D, I think.
it's great. Now let's do this, JP. I'm gonna shift gears on us here. Just
Okay.
gonna be mindful of time. You bring a unique vantage point. Not only do you have a kind of a starry career here in leadership positions as a practitioner, you also host your own podcast and have had many guests that have come through your show. If we can just shift gears, and what is some of the best insights or themes that you've heard from your guests that maybe you can summarize for our audience?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question I get quite often. I started the Future of HR podcast really to inspire the next generation of HR leaders. So
Hmm.
it was really the idea of like all the great mentoring and coaching that you and I have had in our career. Like, how do we bring those conversations to a podcast but targeted towards, learning development, talent, HR? And so the perspective I'm going to give you is really from our CHROs, because the CHROs I talk to have been world class. And there's really three key themes that kind of come out of that. The first is HR is not about HR. And this is really David Ulrich speaking. And he was one of our podcast guests. And so the most CHROs would resonate with that. And the idea is that, HR is not about HR, it's about success in the marketplace. And without that, there's no workplace, right? And so the idea that a lot of
Yes.
times we think about learning, he would say, hey, learning development so that the organization wins, employee experience so that we have a high performing culture, whatever it happens to be. The end game is not the training product. It's not the talent, the HR stuff. It's really making sure we have the talent and capabilities to win in the marketplace. And so that's really critical. So that business piece is huge, right? So knowing the business, being out in the business. And I think he said something in the podcast that not being fluent, you don't need to be fluent in business. But if you go to France, you need to be able to speak enough French to get by or
Right.
a coffee. And that's the same thing in business. So you don't have to understand and read a P&L like your CFO, but you certainly should understand the levers of how you make money, why you make money, where margin goes up and down. And you can get those informations very simply, right? That's not as hard as you think to get that. The other piece is having outside influence, looking kind of outside what's happening in the marketplace, bringing that in. And I think for L&D leaders, this is critical because you see like the use of AI, we should be thinking, what does that mean for our workforce? How would you upskill someone to AI? How do you learn some of these tools, right? So when we start to see what's happening externally, we got to bring that in. That's really critical. And the last is using data, facts, questions to have influence and judgment around that. So that's what HR is not HR, right? It's all about kind of being really an influential business leader that understands key trends. The second theme is surprising a little bit because we talk a lot about AI and technology, but technology isn't the heartbeat of HR. It's an enabler. And so the best CHROs aren't talking about the newest technology program they're putting in. They're talking about how that is enabled to drive productivity, reduce low value work, free up capacity, transform
Hmm.
the employee experience. So what I just caution all of our L&D leaders out there is I know we get excited about the newest learning experience platforms and all those different things. There's a lot of amazing tools and bells and whistles. Be thoughtful of the end game of like, how does this drive revenue? How does this drive productivity? Like, well, how does this actually tie back to helping us in the right way, right? And helping
Yeah.
the business move forward, not just to get the tool or technology for technology's sake. And the last is kind of talked about this already, but it actually kind of ties in. I called it execution plus. And so all the CHROs talked about the fact
Hmm.
that you have to be able to do the basics every day flawlessly and deliver and have that credibility to do the plus, to go beyond, to deliver more value. And so just like you talked about that learning question, if you've got credibility issues with your learning and development function for some reason, because you haven't been able to deliver programs in a certain way, maybe you had too many projects, not enough resources, you got to fix that first. They're
Yeah.
not, when businesses are going to let you come in and do higher value, more strategic work, if you're not doing onboarding training properly, if compliance training's a mess, as an example. So execution plus is kind of what people talked about a lot in that in general. So three trends. I mean, HR is not about HR. Technology isn't the heartbeat of HR, and execution plus are three things I've heard, kind of over and over again from the CHROs on the podcast.
Yeah, again, I just such sound advice. That first one, like, really strikes a chord. By the way, we just had Dave on our show. It's not published as of this recording yet, but
Awesome.
I could hear so much of Dave speaking as you were sharing, with his the capability matrix or capability model. Hey, on that first one, as a practitioner that's a chief revenue officer, one of the things that I talk about frequently is jobs to be done theory, which is a theory initially by an economist, but the whole premise is that nobody wants to buy your product or service. In this case, HR, they're hiring you to get a job done. And kind of the famous line that gets used is nobody wants a quarter-inch drill bit. You want a quarter-inch hole. The drill bit's just a tool to get there. And take the analogy, I think it applies to any function within the business of what we're being asked to do ultimately is to drive an end outcome. I think sometimes like that end outcome gets lost along the way, which I think was part of your kind of second point about don't let technology get in the way of doing what you're ultimately trying to accomplish. We need to innovate and adopt to keep pace with the market and be leading. But I think sometimes that can be at the expense of missing on the basics, that the foundations of execution. I think that's just really prudent advice, JP.
Yeah, no, I love that the jobs to be done. I think it's a really important mindset to think through. I think that's a great mindset for not only talent leaders, HR, and L&D, just thinking what are the jobs to be done and how are we solving that today? So that's a
Yeah.
great model.
Hey, on as a talent technologist, somebody who works in the field, I am curious. What's some tech that you're excited about right now? It doesn't have to be ours, by the way. Just it broadly in the market. Like, what's some of the things that are getting you excited that may have application this year and the distant future?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot going on in the AI space. What I'm excited about to see is AI as kind of a digital coach. There's
Yeah.
platforms that would record this call and then tell me how I spoke and how I could speak better, have more influence.
Hmm.
There, I think, is a whole lot of capability around leveraging AI as a coach to say, I'm gonna have a difficult conversation with a team member. I'm gonna role play that. I mean, I think that's going to continue to grow for
Yes.
sure. Um, you know, there's so much out there, to be honest, but those are two that I think are really interesting. That I think the L&D space, because a lot of times it's really democratizing coaching, democratizing kind of that great feedback. Usually, you're hoping to find an L&D person to maybe bounce their ideas off of, to have a difficult conversation, or find an HR person to do that. Yeah, I think there's apps that come out there and be pretty well designed to do that work. So that's pretty cool.
I share your enthusiasm for this exact use case, and it's one that in most revenue functions we've actually had access to this tech. It's a little more prevalent. I'd say we're kind of in some of those nascent early use cases. Many sales organizations out there, customer success organizations, the concept of call recording and early forms of AI for analysis on performance have been around for a while, but I'm seeing it with partnerships that we have. Like, it's getting so much better so quickly. And I think we'll see those use cases, to your point, expand from client facing team members to internal use cases where I think they can do a lot of good when managed appropriately with the right set of governance around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're so early in this phase, and so we'll find out kind of what it looks like. It's hard to say.
So, hey, JP, to maybe wrap us on the episode here, you mentioned about inspiring the next generation. That was kind of one of those whys driving spinning up your podcast. What advice do you have for somebody who's earlier in their career? They're looking to become a VP of L&D or look to be chief learning officer. What advice would you share to them?
Yeah, so I think early in your career, the more generic advice, but the research would say, is that you got to be someone who's results driven. So deliver results, right? You got to be able to take on new challenges, raise your hand, say yes, continue to explore, look for work that needs to be done that maybe people aren't doing, right? And basically kind of create projects and take those initiatives. Be a great team member and collaborator. That's overall and kind of more, I think, when you think about getting to be a high performer, that people think about you for bigger jobs. From more L&D standpoint, or talent standpoint, I'm going to say the 20, 70, 10, right? 20%, find a great mentor, find a great boss. And I say that because a lot of what we do in this business is art and science. And so you need to understand the science, but the art only comes from working with somebody else. It's really an apprenticeship style experience. To become a great chief learning officer, you're going to have to work with chief learning officers to understand how it works, see them operate, see how they do it, working great companies. So trying to find a great boss or mentor is critical. Not easy, but it's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Second, I think about collecting experiences. both, from, I would say, from you want to be a chief learning officer, you have to do some content design, content delivery, technology, learning experience platforms, right? And then leadership and kind of putting all that together. That's really important to kind of try to have experiences along all three. Talent, I think it's talent assessment, performance management, organizational effectiveness, leadership development, and maybe a bonus area is talent acquisition to be a chief talent officer. Because you need to understand all those different areas and have experience across that path. And so that's where if you've been in a role for 3 or 4 years, or you kind of know your stuff, you've done it multiple times. Hey, I need to make a move. Can I go lateral? It's okay to go lateral. We don't do that enough, frankly, because the more lateral you go and the more you've now worked across the entire kind of learning development team, all of it, right? You're better positioned to be the leader of that entire function because you've done all the different tasks, right? You understand how the job's to be done to your language. The last I would just say is the 10%, right? It's really reading, learning, listen to podcasts, listen to your podcast, my podcast, lots of better podcasts, great podcasts out there, read books, go to conferences, understand AI, and be a critical consumer of what's going on and kind of don't always believe everything you hear from a vendor or, a new technology solution. You got to make sure, hey, this makes sense. It resonates for us. It'll work for our culture, for our organization, for our business at this moment. So that's my kind of best experience or my best advice for folks who want to grow and learn. I mean, it's going to take 20 years. Look, I mean, I look back and say the first 10 years of your life is just all about learning. Yeah, maybe 10 to 15, frankly. And then after that, you can harvest it and really put that to use as in more leadership roles.
JP, I love the list and I love the order. And if I can, I'm going to go back to the very first one because I think it was very appropriately number one on the list. What you labeled as results focused. Like, I'll just tie that in with the two other pieces that to me they're all saying the same thing. One of my favorite books is An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth by Commander Chris Hadfield, the guy who played guitar from the International Space Station. Is probably his most famous for broadly. But in his book, he has a whole chapter called "Aim to be a Zero," which is a little counterintuitive. But the whole premise is particularly when you're new at something, and you try to come in guns blazing, oftentimes you end up being a detractor. When if you just focused on getting really good at the basics when you're in new environments. And if there's any Shark Tank fans out there, one of my favorite one-liners from Mark Cuban is, you got to crawl before you ball. I think in today's like social media focused instant gratification world, it's really easy to try to shortcut and miss really on executing on the fundamentals. And you brought this up earlier, like, you're probably not going to get a lot of buy-in to do some exotic training program if you're not nailing compliance, if you're not nailing onboarding. If those fundamental programs, if those aren't in really good shape, you're probably not going to go get the 501 level courseware that you want to do. Get really good at the basics first. I thought that was a great one to put first on the list.
That's great. Well, I like that crawl before you ball. And you're right. I mean, I think we overestimate what we can learn in a year, and we sometimes underestimate how important it is to have 2 or 3 years in a role where you kind of understand how things work, multiple times, because you continue to learn. I mean, you're always learning the job, and that's critical. So.
Perfect. Hey, JP, I can't thank you enough for being here. If you're not already, please follow JP, Future of HR podcast. You can find JP Elliot on LinkedIn. Anywhere else that we need to be looking for you, JP?
Nope, that's perfect. Those are the 2 places. Thanks, Chris. Great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Likewise. Thanks to the audience. I appreciate you popping into another episode of L&D Unlocked. If you're not subscribed, please go ahead and do that now. You can hit the little bell and make sure you get notified every time new episodes drop, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks so much, JP.
This episode has been brought to you by BizLibrary. Head to bizlibrary.com for more information.